Hey everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships with Nubicon. Today, I thought we'd have a look at the USS New Orleans CA-32 herself, and have a look at a bit of her service history and what she did during World War II. If you want the review on the look at the New Orleans class itself, you want the previous video to this one. In that video, I talk about the New Orleans class itself and how I feel about most of the US cruiser line. But anyway, today's video, USS New Orleans. She was laid down on the 14th of March 1931 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. However, this wasn't the first time she was laid down. Before 1930, she was laid down as a Portland-class cruiser alongside the Astoria and the Minneapolis. All three ships were later reordered to the Tuscaloosa class design in 1930. The ships that were eventually built under this design were first known as the Astoria Class, but later went on to be known as the New Orleans class of cruiser. Eventually, 7 ships were built under this design. And during World War II, this class of ship became one of the most decorated classes in the US Navy. Altogether, these 7 ships earned 64 battle stars, with the New Orleans herself earning 17 of those stars. Now, the New Orleans was completed and launched on the 12th of April 1933, and she wasn't commissioned until the 15th of February 1934 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And over the next few years after her commissioning, she was involved in some pretty interesting events, including one of the largest mock battles ever staged and conducted. But it was on the 7th of December 1941, while she was moored in Pearl Harbor, where she would see her first wartime action. She was moored in the harbour, undergoing engine repairs, when the first of the Japanese planes began their attack. And so at the time, the New Orleans was actually getting her power from the dockyard she was moored to. And so when the dockyard's power went out, so did all the lights on the ship, which meant that her engineers had to use flashlights to try and get around and start the engines on the New Orleans, which isn't an easy job really when it's daylight and you can see properly anyway. But to do it with flashlights, that's pretty crazy. And of course, to make matters worse, the keys for the ammunition ready boxes had gone missing. So the crew had to end up breaking the locks on the lock boxes so that they could get their ammunition out. While many of the men were trying to fire at the Japanese attackers with rifles and pistols, others that usually manned the AA guns had to actually manually aim the guns because there was no power to the guns in order to be able to fire these AA guns at those planes. And some of these guns pretty damn heavy. And all of this while everybody was trying, at least everybody topside, was trying to duck machine gun bullets and shrapnel from the onslaught of the Japanese fighters and planes shooting at them. And of course, without power, the ammunition hoists were unable to be used because they didn't have the power in order to operate them. So it meant that the ammunition that was stored below deck wasn't able to get up to the top deck. So the only ammunition the people on deck had to use was what was in the ammunition lockboxes. And in the end, they had to rig up manual hoists in order to get these shells up to the men. So every man that didn't have a specific job formed an ammunition line to get the shells to the guns. But in spite of all this, the New Orleans didn't suffer any severe damage during the attack. She did have a fragmentation bomb which exploded on board and injured a few of her crew. But the Japanese focus wasn't on the cruisers. They wanted to hit those battleships and hit them hard. And while the New Orleans herself was not the focus of the attack, the Japanese intent was clear. They wanted to create panic, mayhem and destruction. And I'm pretty sure that left some pretty severe mental damage on the crew of the New Orleans, watching this hellish attack in this hellish environment and seeing its aftermath. New Orleans' engines were never able to be fully repaired at Pearl Harbor. She had to sail back to San Francisco on the 13th of January 1942 for the engines to be fully repaired and ready. She also had a new radar system installed and 20mm guns. And on the 12th of February, after the installations and repairs had been completed, she escorted a troop convoy to Brisbane in Australia. And from Australia, she would then return to Pearl Harbor to join Task Force 11. and as part of this task force, she would join up with the Yorktown task force on the 15th of April, southwest of the New Hebrides. This was the task force group that eventually won the Battle of the Coral Sea on the 7th and 8th of May. They were able to drive back the southward thrust of the Japanese that threatened Australia and New Zealand at the time. Unfortunately, this small victory did come with a pretty steep price. The Yorktown was damaged heavily, and the Lexington was lost. The New Orleans crew stood by the Lexington as she sunk, and her men dove into the water, dodging dangers, flying debris, exploding ordnance, and managed to save 580 of the Lexington's crew, whom they took back to Naumei in order for them to be treated for their injuries. New Orleans then patrolled the eastern Solomons until sailing back to Pearl Harbor to replenish her supplies and equipment. On the 28th of May, she set sail once again as escort of the USS Enterprise on her way to rendezvous with the Yorktown Task Force. This task force was made up of the 3 Yorktown class aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the heavily patched USS Yorktown, which had suffered extensive damage during the Battle of the Coral Sea only a few weeks earlier. And on the 4th of June 1942, this task force would engage the Japanese in the Battle of Midway, where they would strike a blow to the Japanese fleet and its ability to make war in the Pacific, and eventually pretty much turn the war in this one battle. Now, naval battles had evolved so much in just that single year since the first attack on Pearl Harbor, that ship-to-ship combat was not really a big thing in the war anymore. The Battle of Midway itself basically consisted of aerial attacks on forces, but that doesn't mean that the New Orleans didn't play a big part in protecting these aircraft carriers. Her anti-air guns protected the Yorktown, as well as the Hornet and the Enterprise, through most of this battle. And when the Yorktown had moved forward and was separated from the other two and she was coming under heavy dive bomber attack, the New Orleans guns managed to stop a lot of that attack by the Japanese. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save the Yorktown, which was just too severely damaged from the previous battle, as well as all the focus that she was getting in this battle, and eventually she did capitulate and sink. Later that year, the New Orleans would once again participate in another major battle, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. During this battle, she provided aid to the Marines holding a precarious toehold on the Guadalcanal, as the Japanese landing expedition was turned back during this conflict. By the end of this battle, the New Orleans had been in the Coral Sea for 2 months, and the food on board had begun to run low. The crew had to be put on half rations, and Spam became the main course of every meal. And at this point, when the Saratoga got hit by a torpedo on the 31st of August, it almost felt like a blessing, since it meant that they could then escort her back to Pearl Harbor, where they would arrive on the 21st of September. She returned to the Solomons on the 27th of November alongside 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers, where they all engaged in the Battle of Tassafaronga on the night of the 30th of November. During this battle, the group's flagship, the Minneapolis, was struck by 2 torpedoes. The New Orleans was sailing just astern of her, which meant that she had to turn rapidly in order to avoid colliding with the Minneapolis. This unfortunately put her in a position where she was then struck by a torpedo in her forward magazines and gasoline tanks. The resulting explosion severed the first 150 feet of the bow of the New Orleans from the ship, just forward of turret number 2. This severed piece of the bow, including turret number 1, swung around to the port side of the ship and punctured several holes in the length of the New Orleans hull before it sank at the stern and damaged the port inboard propeller. With the loss of that quarter of the ship, the forward quarter of the ship, New Orleans was in some pretty big trouble. She could only manage 2 knots, which is about 2.3 miles per hour or 3.7 kilometers an hour, depending on where you live. And to add to that, she was also on fire in that forward little section that was left. It took some pretty big acts of heroism and self-sacrifice, as well as some pretty skilled seamanship, in order to get this ship into Tulagi Harbour near daybreak on the 1st of December, where the crew was then able to camouflage her so that she wouldn't be attacked again and they wouldn't be found. so that they would have time to work furiously clearing away wreckage and trying to shore up enough to be able to sail her somewhere where she could be repaired. It took the crew 11 days to shore the ship up enough and clear away enough wreckage so that they would be able to sail the ship to somewhere where it could be repaired. And once they were ready, they sailed the ship to Cockatoo Island dockyard in Sydney, Australia. During this voyage, they had to sail the New Orleans stern first so that she wouldn't sink on them. They eventually arrived on the 24th of December, 1942. While at the Cockatoo Island dockyard, they were able to replace the propeller and make some repairs to the ship, including installing a temporary stub bow. On the 7th of March 1943, she was to leave Sydney and headed back to the United States to the Puget Sound Navy Yard. But because of the extensive damage that she suffered, she also had to make this journey sailing entirely backwards. Once there, she underwent a major refit, where all her wartime damage was repaired, her bow was replaced, and all of her boilers, machinery, and hull structures were overhauled to almost new condition. In addition to this, she was also fitted with new air and surface search radars, as well as numerous 20mm and 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns. After this refit, on the 31st of August 1943, she once again returned to Pearl Harbor for combat training. For the rest of 1943, New Orleans mostly took part in the assistance of bombardments of islands, including the bombardment of Wake Island on the 5th and 6th of October, as well as bombardments in the Gilberts on the 20th of November. She was later then used as a screen for carriers striking the Eastern Marshalls on the 4th of December, at which point the new USS Lexington was struck by a torpedo, and New Orleans guarded her successful retirement to repairs at Pearl Harbor, arriving on the 9th of December. Throughout the rest of the war, the New Orleans role didn't change that much. She assisted troops where she was needed, and she screened aircraft carriers for most of the major engagements left in the Pacific. Unfortunately, aircraft carriers and aircraft from these carriers became the major strike force of both navies during this part of the war. Surface-to-surface combat had become vastly a major thing of the past. But the New Orleans did have times where she would face surface targets, like when she was assisting at the Truk Islands. While the carriers launched airstrikes, New Orleans and other warships would circle the atoll to catch escaping ships. The task force combined gunfire sank a light cruiser, a destroyer, a trawler, and a submarine chaser. But other than this, New Orleans found very few opportunities to use her main guns against any surface targets. But that doesn't mean that her 8-inch guns suddenly became absolutely useless. They were still very good for bombarding targets on islands, such as when she was used to bombard the Saipan Islands, and during the invasion of Iwo Jima, as well as later on during the invasion of Okinawa in 1945. But in the end, her main role was very clear. She was a carrier escort, and she was very good in that role, especially during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as well as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where she defended her carriers fiercely from aircraft attack. And on the 23rd of April 1945, she would see her final wartime engagement, where she would use her guns to dual shore batteries and fire directly against the enemy lines. After nearly 2 months on station, she sailed to replenish and repair in the Philippines, and was anchored at Subic Bay when hostilities and the war were finally ended. Now this brief video doesn't really do the New Orleans her full justice. If you want that, you're going to have to go and look her up yourself and read as many books about her as you can, because in spite of the fact that she was reduced to being a carrier escort and a shore bombarder, there are still some pretty exciting stories in there. And by the end of World War II, she had earned herself 17 battle stars, as well as an American Defense Service Medal, an American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, World War II Victory Medal, 5 Navy Crosses, 10 Silver Stars, 1 Bronze Star, 1 Air Medal, and 206 Purple Hearts awarded to the members of her crew. This ship definitely did its part, and definitely deserves every accolade she ever got, and I know that she is held in high regard in a lot of places in the United States. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Give us a like if you liked it, Leave a comment, maybe you have a good story about the New Orleans that I don't know about, or any other of the New Orleans class, or any other cruiser in the US Navy. I would love to hear about those stories. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, and have fun with whatever it is you're playing out there, and I'll catch you all next time.